The mountain air was thin and cold as Sarah Martinez adjusted her position behind the rocky outcrop. She had been watching the valley below for 3 hours through her high-powered scope, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid morning air. As one of the few female snipers in the special operations community, Sarah had earned her reputation through countless missions where her steady hand and sharp eye had saved lives. The radio crackled softly in her ear, breaking the silence that had settled over the Afghan mountains. Overwatch, this is Bravo Team. We have eyes on the target compound. Beginning approach in 15 minutes. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Jake Torres, leader of a 6-man SEAL team that had been inserted into the area under cover of darkness. Sarah shifted slightly, her rifle trained on the cluster of mud brick buildings nestled in the valley floor. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target was hiding there, surrounded by heavily armed militants. The mission was supposed to be straightforward: get in, capture or eliminate the target, and extract before dawn. But Sarah had learned long ago that nothing in these mountains was ever straightforward. Through her scope, she could see movement around the compound. Men with assault rifles moved between the buildings, their patterns suggesting they were more organized than typical Taliban fighters. Something felt wrong about the whole situation, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. "Copy that, Bravo Team," Sarah whispered into her radio. "I count 12 hostiles in the compound. 2 on the north wall, 3 patrolling the courtyard, 4 more spread around the perimeter. No sign of civilians." The SEAL team had been operating in the region for 2 weeks following leads about a bomb maker who had been responsible for several devastating attacks on coalition forces. Sarah had been assigned as their Overwatch sniper, providing long-range protection and intelligence from her position high in the mountains. As she watched, the SEAL team began their approach. Even through her scope, she could barely make out their ghostly figures moving through the pre-dawn darkness. They were professionals, moving like shadows across the rocky terrain. Sarah had worked with many special operations teams before, but the SEALs had always impressed her with their precision and discipline. The compound below seemed quiet, almost too quiet. The guards continued their lazy patrols, unaware that death was approaching from the darkness. Sarah counted heartbeats, watching for any sign that the mission might be compromised. "Bravo Team is in position," Torres reported. "Breaching in 30 seconds. Sarah's finger moved to her trigger guard, ready to provide cover fire if needed. Her rifle was a custom-built precision weapon, capable of reaching out and touching targets at distances that seemed impossible to most people. She had practiced with it until it felt like an extension of her body. The first sign of trouble came not from the compound, but from her peripheral vision. Movement on the ridgeline to the east caught her attention, and she swiveled her scope to investigate. What she saw made her blood run cold. A line of vehicles was winding its way up the mountain road, their headlights cutting through the darkness. As they drew closer, Sarah could make out the distinctive shapes of technicals, pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns. There were at least 8 vehicles carrying what looked like 40 or 50 fighters. "Bravo Team, abort mission." Sarah's voice cut through the radio with urgent intensity. "Large enemy force approaching from the east. Multiple vehicles, heavy weapons. You're about to be surrounded," but it was too late. The SEAL team had already begun their assault, and the sound of gunfire erupted from the compound below. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as the SEALs engaged the enemy, but Sarah knew they were walking into a trap. The approaching vehicles had timed their arrival perfectly. As soon as the shooting started, they accelerated toward the compound, their goal clearly to surround the SEAL team and cut off any escape route. Sarah made a quick calculation. The vehicles would reach the compound in less than 5 minutes. The SEAL team was caught in the open, engaged with enemies in the buildings while more enemies approached from behind. They needed immediate support, and she was the only one in position to provide it. Without hesitation, Sarah began engaging the lead vehicle. Her first shot punched through the windshield, and the truck swerved off the road before rolling down a steep embankment. The convoy scattered, but they kept coming. "Overwatch is engaging enemy reinforcements," she reported, working the bolt of her rifle smoothly. "Bravo Team, you need to extract now. You're about to have company." The radio crackled with the sounds of intense combat. She could hear Torres shouting orders to his men, the distinctive crack of M4 rifles, and the heavier thump of enemy AK-47s. The SEAL team was fighting for their lives, but they were professional warriors who had trained for exactly this situation. Sarah continued picking off targets from her elevated position, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. The enemy had too many fighters and they were closing in fast. The SEAL team needed a miracle, and Sarah was determined to give them one. As she lined up her next shot, Sarah thought about the path that had brought her to this moment. Growing up in a small Texas town, she had always been drawn to the military. Her father had been a Marine, and he had taught her to shoot when she was barely tall enough to hold a rifle properly. She had excelled at marksmanship from an early age, but becoming a sniper in the special operations community had required years of training and proving herself against skeptical male colleagues. The sound of explosions echoed across the valley as the SEAL team used grenades to fight their way out of the compound. Sarah could see muzzle flashes moving through the buildings as they conducted a fighting withdrawal, but the enemy reinforcements were getting closer with each passing second. Her radio crackled again, and this time Torres's voice carried a note of desperation that sent a chill down her spine. Overwatch, we're taking heavy casualties. Request immediate extraction support. We have wounded and cannot move fast enough to evade pursuit. Sarah's jaw tightened as she realized the full magnitude of the situation. The SEAL team was trapped, wounded, and running out of ammunition. The enemy forces would soon overwhelm them, and without immediate help, 6 of America's elite warriors would not be coming home. Sarah's mind raced as she processed the desperate situation unfolding below. The SEAL team was pinned down in a dried riverbed about 200 meters from the compound, using the rocky walls for cover. Enemy fighters were advancing from 3 directions, and the convoy of technicals had reached the compound, disgorging more militants into the fight. Overwatch, we need suppressing fire on the North Ridge. Torres's voice came through the radio between bursts of gunfire. They're trying to flank us from the high ground. Sarah swung her rifle toward the indicated position and immediately spotted 3 fighters working their way along the ridge with what appeared to be an RPG launcher. She took a deep breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The lead fighter dropped instantly, and his companions dove for cover behind the rocks. But even as she engaged new targets, Sarah knew that her position was becoming untenable. The enemy had spotted her muzzle flashes and were beginning to direct fire toward her position. Bullets whined overhead and sparked off the rocks around her as she was forced to keep her head down. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Through brief glimpses between enemy fire, Sarah could see that the SEAL team was running low on ammunition. Their rate of fire had decreased significantly, and they were being forced to make every shot count. Worse, she could see at least 2 team members who appeared to be wounded and unable to move effectively. Command, this is Overwatch. Sarah spoke into her radio, switching to the command frequency. Bravo team is in serious trouble. They need immediate extraction support. Request gunship support and medical evacuation. The response came back several minutes later, and it wasn't what she wanted to hear. Overwatch, nearest support is 40 minutes out. Weather is moving in, and we may not be able to get aircraft into your area. Bravo team needs to find a way to break contact and move to an alternate extraction point. Sarah cursed under her breath. 40 minutes might as well have been 40 hours given the current situation. The SEAL team would be overrun long before help arrived, and moving wounded men across the rough mountain terrain while under fire was nearly impossible. As she watched, the enemy fighters began coordinating their assault more effectively. They had brought up mortars and were beginning to bracket the SEAL team's position with increasingly accurate fire. Each explosion sent rocks and debris flying, and Sarah could see that the Americans' cover was being systematically destroyed. Overwatch. We're taking mortar fire, Torres reported, his voice tight with strain. Rodriguez is hit bad and Jackson can't put weight on his left leg. We need options. Sarah studied the terrain below through her scope, looking for anything that might give the SEAL team an advantage. The dried riverbed where they had taken cover offered some protection, but it also trapped them in a natural kill zone. The enemy was using the high ground effectively, pouring fire down on them from multiple positions. Then she spotted something that made her heart race. About 400 meters to the west of the SEAL team's position, there was a narrow canyon that cut deep into the mountainside. If the team could reach it, they would have solid cover from the mortar fire and a potential escape route. But getting there would require crossing an open area that was completely exposed to enemy fire. Bravo team, I have a possible route out, Sarah transmitted. Canyon to your west, bearing 270. It's about a 4-minute run across open ground, but once you're in there, you'll have cover and concealment. Copy that, Torres replied. But we can't move with the wounded under this much fire. We need you to create a diversion. Sarah understood immediately what he was asking. To give the SEAL team a chance to escape, she would need to draw the enemy's attention to her position. That meant abandoning her concealed overwatch post and exposing herself to direct enemy fire. It was essentially a suicide mission, but it was the only way to save the lives of 6 American warriors. Without hesitation, Sarah began gathering her equipment. She stripped her rifle down to its essentials, keeping only what she would need for a mobile fighting withdrawal. Extra ammunition, water, and her sidearm were all she could afford to carry if she was going to stay ahead of the enemy fighters who would inevitably come after her. Give me 2 minutes to get into position, she told Torres. When I start shooting, move your team as fast as you can toward that canyon. I'll keep them busy. Sarah moved quickly but carefully down the backside of her ridge, staying low to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. The sound of gunfire continued to echo across the valley, punctuated by the occasional mortar explosion. Every blast reminded her that time was running out for the trapped SEAL team. As she moved, Sarah thought about the men she was trying to save. She had worked with Torres before, and knew him to be a dedicated leader who would never abandon his men. Rodriguez was a demolitions expert from California with a wife and 2 young children. Jackson was a communications specialist who had been talking about retiring after this deployment. These weren't just fellow soldiers to her. They were friends and brothers in arms. Finding a new position on a different ridge, Sarah set up her rifle and began scanning for targets. From this angle, she could see the enemy positions more clearly, and she didn't like what she saw. The militants were well organized and appeared to be following a coordinated plan. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a carefully planned ambush. In position, she reported. Beginning suppression fire in 10 seconds. When you hear my first shot, move. Sarah took aim at what appeared to be a command position, where several enemy fighters were gathered around radio equipment. She could see one man who seemed to be directing the others, pointing toward different positions and speaking urgently into a handheld radio. Her first shot took out the leader, causing immediate confusion among his men. Sarah followed up quickly, engaging targets systematically and creating maximum chaos among the enemy ranks. As planned, her aggressive fire drew immediate retaliation, and she could see muzzle flashes turning toward her position. Through her scope, she caught a glimpse of the SEAL team beginning their desperate dash toward the canyon. Torres was in the lead, followed by 2 team members carrying the wounded Rodriguez between them. Jackson was limping badly but keeping up with the group, and the remaining 2 SEALs were providing rearguard security. The enemy fighters quickly realized what was happening and began shifting their fire toward the escaping Americans. Sarah increased her rate of fire, picking off anyone who tried to draw a bead on the running SEALs. Her rifle grew hot in her hands as she worked the bolt rapidly, sending round after round downrange with deadly precision. Suddenly, her radio crackled with Torres's voice, strained but relieved. Overwatch, we're in the canyon. Good shooting. Now you need to get out of there before they come for you. But as Sarah looked around at the enemy positions below, she realized that escaping would not be easy. The militants had figured out her location and were already sending teams to outflank her position. She was about to find herself in the same desperate situation that the SEAL team had just escaped from. Sarah could hear the enemy fighters climbing up the ridge toward her position, their voices carrying through the thin mountain air as they coordinated their approach. She had maybe 3 minutes before they reached her, and the terrain offered limited escape routes. The ridge she was on dropped off sharply on 3 sides, leaving only one narrow path that would take her deeper into enemy-controlled territory. Overwatch, what's your status? Torres's voice came through her radio as she gathered her equipment. I've got company coming up the hill, Sarah replied, slinging her rifle across her back. Moving to secondary position. Continue toward the extraction point. But Sarah knew there was no secondary position. She had chosen this ridge specifically because it offered the best fields of fire, not because it provided good escape routes. Now that tactical decision was about to cost her dearly. As she started down the backside of the ridge, Sarah could hear her pursuers getting closer. They were moving fast, probably sensing that they had cornered their prey. She needed to find cover quickly and try to even the odds before they overwhelmed her with superior numbers. A cluster of large boulders about 50 meters down the slope offered the only decent cover in sight. Sarah made it there just as the first enemy fighter appeared on the ridgeline above her. She pressed herself against the cold stone and drew her sidearm, knowing that the confined space would make her rifle too cumbersome for the close quarters fighting that was about to begin. The first fighter moved carelessly, silhouetted against the sky as he searched for her. Sarah's pistol barked once and he tumbled down the slope, but his fall alerted the others to her position, and suddenly the air around her was filled with the angry buzz of rifle bullets. Sarah counted muzzle flashes and estimated at least 6 fighters on the ridge above her. They had the high ground and superior numbers, but they were also exposed on the skyline. She used that to her advantage, picking her shots carefully and forcing them to take cover. Meanwhile, her radio crackled with updates from the SEAL team. Overwatch, we're moving through the canyon. Rodriguez is stable but needs medical attention soon. We should reach the alternate extraction point in 20 minutes. 20 minutes felt like an eternity as Sarah continued her deadly game of hide-and-seek among the rocks. The enemy fighters were getting bolder, working their way down the slope in bounds while their companions provided covering fire. She was running low on ammunition for her pistol and would soon be forced to transition back to her rifle. Despite the awkward angles, then she heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of vehicles approaching from below. Looking through a gap in the rocks, she could see more technicals winding their way up the mountain road. The enemy was bringing reinforcements to ensure she didn't escape. This is going to get interesting, Sarah muttered to herself as she checked her remaining ammunition. 3 magazines for her pistol, and 2 for her rifle, not much to hold off what looked like an entire company of fighters. But Sarah Martinez hadn't survived 3 combat deployments by giving up when things looked hopeless. Growing up on her family's ranch in Texas, she had learned to be resourceful and stubborn. Her father used to say that Martinez women were too mean to die easy, and she intended to prove him right. The enemy fighters were getting closer, and Sarah could hear them calling out to each other in Pashto. They were coordinating their approach, probably planning to rush her position from multiple directions simultaneously. She needed to disrupt their plan before they could execute it. Pulling a grenade from her vest, Sarah armed it and cooked it for 2 seconds before lobbing it up the slope toward the largest concentration of voices. The explosion echoed across the mountains, followed by screams and shouts of confusion. In the chaos that followed, Sarah moved to a new position among the rocks. Her radio crackled again with Torres's voice. Overwatch, we can hear heavy fighting at your position. Do you need us to come back for you? Negative, Sarah replied firmly, even as bullets sparked off the rocks around her. Continue to extraction. That's an order. She might only be a sergeant, but in this situation, she was the ranking sniper, and she wasn't about to let the SEAL team compromise their escape by coming back for her. The enemy fighters regrouped quickly after the grenade blast, and Sarah could see them spreading out to surround her position. They were learning to respect her shooting ability and were being more cautious in their approach. That bought her time, but also meant they were less likely to make the mistakes she needed them to make. As the sun began to rise over the mountains, Sarah's situation became even more desperate. The increasing light would soon eliminate her concealment advantage, and the enemy would be able to coordinate their assault more effectively. She needed to break contact and find a new position, but every route of escape seemed to lead deeper into enemy territory. Then she spotted something that gave her hope. About 100 meters to her left, a narrow ravine cut down through the mountainside. It was steep and dangerous, but it might provide a way out if she could reach it without being seen. The problem was that getting there would require crossing an open area where she would be completely exposed. Sarah waited for the right moment, listening to the enemy fighters as they continued to close in on her position. When she heard most of them moving to her right, probably planning to assault from that direction, she made her move. Sprinting across the open ground, Sarah felt bullets whipping past her as the enemy fighters spotted her movement. She dove into the ravine just as a burst of automatic fire chewed up the ground where she had been standing. The ravine was deeper than it had appeared from her previous position, and she tumbled several feet before managing to control her descent. The rocky walls of the ravine provided excellent cover, but they also limited her ability to see what the enemy was doing. Sarah could hear them shouting to each other, probably trying to figure out where she had gone. Some of them would undoubtedly follow her into the ravine, while others would try to get ahead of her and set up an ambush farther down. As she worked her way down the narrow passage, Sarah's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. Overwatch, this is Guardian Angel. We have you on thermal imaging and are tracking multiple hostiles converging on your position. We're inbound with close air support, ETA 12 minutes. Sarah felt a surge of relief at the sound of the pilot's voice. Guardian Angel was the call sign for an AC-130 gunship, a flying arsenal that could provide devastating close air support. But 12 minutes was still a long time when enemy fighters were breathing down her neck. Copy, Guardian Angel, she replied. I'm in a ravine moving west down the mountainside. Hostiles are pursuing on foot and have vehicles positioned on the roads below. I'll mark my position with infrared strobe when you're close. As if to emphasize the urgency of her situation, Sarah heard voices echoing down the ravine behind her. The enemy fighters had found her trail and were following her into the rocky passage. She increased her pace, knowing that the ravine would eventually lead her down to the valley floor where the vehicles were waiting. The ravine twisted and turned as it descended the mountainside, sometimes narrowing to barely shoulder width before opening into small chambers, carved by centuries of flash floods. Sarah moved as quickly as she dared, knowing that a twisted ankle or broken bone would mean capture or death. Behind her, the voices of her pursuers grew closer, echoing off the stone walls in a way that made it difficult to judge their exact distance. As she navigated a particularly tight section of the ravine, Sarah's radio came alive with chatter from the SEAL team. Guardian Angel, this is Bravo Team Leader. We have reached the extraction LZ, but are taking sporadic fire from the ridge to our north. Can you provide immediate suppression? Copy, Bravo Team, came the pilot's response. We see your position in the hostile fires. Beginning gun run in 30 seconds. Keep your heads down. Even from her position deep in the ravine, Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of the AC-130's 40mm cannon as it engaged targets around the SEAL team's location. The deep rhythmic thumping echoed across the valley, followed by explosions as the high explosive rounds found their marks. It was the sound of American air power at work, and it gave Sarah hope that the cavalry was finally arriving. But her immediate situation remained desperate. The ravine was leading her inexorably toward the valley floor, where she knew enemy vehicles were positioned to cut off any escape attempt. She needed to find a way to break out of the narrow passage before she reached that killing zone. A side passage, barely visible in the shadows, offered a possible alternative route. Sarah squeezed into the narrow opening, her equipment scraping against the rock walls. The passage was so tight that she had to remove her pack and push it ahead of her. But it seemed to lead back up the mountainside rather than down toward the valley. Behind her, she could hear the enemy fighters reaching the main part of the ravine where she had made her turn. They were arguing about something, probably trying to figure out which way she had gone. Sarah held her breath and listened, hoping they would choose the wrong direction. For a moment it seemed like her luck might hold. The voices grew fainter, suggesting that most of the fighters had continued down the main ravine. But then she heard footsteps in the side passage behind her, and she knew that at least one pursuer had found her trail. The narrow passage opened into a small cave that appeared to have been carved by water erosion over countless years. Ancient rock paintings on the walls suggested that humans had been using this shelter for centuries, but Sarah had no time to appreciate the historical significance. She could hear her pursuer working his way through the tight passage behind her. Sarah positioned herself at the far end of the cave with her rifle ready. When the enemy fighter emerged from the narrow passage, he would be silhouetted against the opening and completely vulnerable. It wasn't sporting, but this wasn't a sporting event, it was a fight for survival. The fighter who squeezed through the opening was young, probably no more than 18 or 19 years old. For a split second, Sarah hesitated, seeing something of herself at that age in his determined expression. But when he raised his AK-47 toward her position, she squeezed the trigger without further thought. The shot echoed loudly in the confined space, and Sarah's ears rang as she quickly moved to the cave entrance to check for other pursuers. The narrow passage appeared empty, but she could hear excited voices from the main ravine as the other fighters reacted to the gunshot. Sarah's radio crackled with an update from Guardian Angel. Overwatch, we have completed our gun run on Bravo Team's position and are now looking for you. Can you mark your position? Negative on the marking, Sarah replied quietly. I'm in a cave system with hostiles close by. Any signal I send will compromise my position to ground forces. Copy that. We'll continue to monitor. Be advised that weather is moving in fast. We may only have a few more minutes on station before we have to RTB. Sarah cursed under her breath. RTB meant return to base, and if the gunship had to leave because of weather, she would be on her own again. The Afghan mountains were notorious for sudden weather changes that could ground aircraft for hours or even days. Exploring the back of the cave, Sarah discovered another passage that led deeper into the mountain. She had no idea where it might lead, but staying in the cave meant being trapped when the other fighters arrived. Sometimes the only way out was through. The passage was even narrower than the first one, forcing Sarah to crawl on her hands and knees while pushing her equipment ahead of her. The walls pressed in from both sides, and she fought down a surge of claustrophobia as she worked her way through the underground maze. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Sarah saw light ahead. The passage opened onto a ledge about halfway up the opposite side of the ravine from where she had started. Below her, she could see several enemy fighters searching the main passage, while others had positioned themselves to watch the exits. From her new vantage point, Sarah had a clear view of the valley below. The SEAL team's extraction was proceeding smoothly, with 2 helicopters on the ground and troops loading the wounded Rodriguez onto a stretcher. But she also counted at least 30 enemy fighters positioned around the valley, all looking for her. Her radio came alive with Torres's voice. "Overwatch, Bravo team is wheels up in 2 minutes. What's your status for extraction?" Sarah looked around at her precarious position. She was trapped on a narrow ledge with enemy fighters both above and below her. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with clouds rolling in from the west and the first drops of rain beginning to fall. Even if she could somehow signal for pickup, there was no suitable landing zone anywhere near her position. "Bravo team, continue with extraction," she replied. "I'm not in a position for immediate pickup. We'll find an alternate route and call for extraction when clear." There was a long pause before Torres responded. "Overwatch, we're not leaving you behind. Give us coordinates and we'll come back for you." "Negative," Sarah said firmly. "You have wounded who need immediate medical attention. I'll find a way out. That's what I do." As the helicopters lifted off with the SEAL team safely aboard, Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and loneliness. She had accomplished her mission. The SEALs were safe and heading home. But now she was alone on a mountain ledge, surrounded by enemies and running low on ammunition, with a storm approaching that would make any rescue attempt impossible. The rain was falling steadier now, making the rocks slippery and reducing visibility. Sarah knew she needed to find better shelter soon, but every movement risked exposing her position to the searchers below. She was trapped between the immediate threat of discovery and the longer-term threat of exposure to the elements. As she considered her options, Sarah heard something that chilled her to the bone, the sound of dogs barking. The enemy had brought tracking dogs to help find her trail. Even if she managed to avoid the human searchers, the dogs would eventually lead their handlers directly to her hiding place. Looking up at the darkening sky, Sarah realized that the storm might actually be her salvation rather than her doom. Heavy rain would wash away her scent trail and make it much harder for the dogs to track her. But it would also make movement treacherous on the wet rocks. And hypothermia would become a real threat if she couldn't find adequate shelter. The sound of the dogs was getting closer, their excited barking suggesting they had found her trail. Sarah made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation. Instead of trying to hide, she would use the approaching storm as cover to continue moving. It was a desperate gamble, but staying put meant certain capture. The rain came down in sheets now, turning the rocky ledge into a treacherous slope of wet stone and loose gravel. Sarah moved carefully along the narrow path, testing each step before committing her weight. One slip would send her tumbling down the mountainside into the arms of the enemy fighters below. The storm was both blessing and curse. While it masked her movements and would soon wash away her scent trail, it also made every step dangerous and threatened to soak through her gear. Mountain hypothermia could kill just as effectively as enemy bullets, and Sarah knew she needed to find proper shelter soon. Through the driving rain, she could hear the dogs barking, becoming more confused and frustrated. The heavy precipitation was indeed washing away her scent, making it harder for the animals to maintain their trail. But she also knew that the enemy fighters would adapt their search tactics, probably spreading out in a wider pattern to compensate for the loss of tracking ability. Sarah's radio crackled with static-filled transmissions as the storm interfered with communications. She caught fragments of conversation between various units but couldn't make out complete messages. The weather was effectively cutting her off from any outside support, leaving her truly alone in hostile territory. As she worked her way along the ledge, Sarah came upon what appeared to be an old shepherd's hut, built into a natural depression in the rock face. The structure was ancient, probably abandoned decades ago, but it offered the first real shelter she had seen since beginning her escape. The problem was that it was also the kind of place that enemy search teams would inevitably check. Sarah approached the hut carefully, her weapon ready. The wooden door hung askew on rusted hinges, and the interior was dark and musty. But it was dry, and after hours in the rain, that was worth considerable risk. She settled into a corner where she could watch the entrance while staying out of sight from casual observation. Inside the hut, Sarah took inventory of her situation. Her ammunition was running dangerously low. Only one magazine left for her rifle and half a magazine for her sidearm. Her water was nearly gone, and she hadn't eaten anything since the night before. Most concerning was the dampness that was starting to seep through her gear despite her best efforts to stay dry. The radio offered only static now as the storm intensified. Even if rescue aircraft were available, which they weren't in this weather, she had no way to communicate her location or status. For the first time since the mission began, Sarah felt truly isolated and vulnerable. Outside, she could hear voices calling to each other through the rain. The search teams were still active despite the weather, probably under orders not to return until they found her. Sarah counted at least 3 different voices, suggesting a team was working its way up the mountainside toward her position. She had maybe 10 minutes before they reached the hut. Sarah considered her options. She could try to ambush them from inside the structure, attempt to slip away into the storm or find a hiding place, and hope they didn't search too thoroughly. None of the choices were particularly appealing. Then Sarah noticed something she had missed in her initial examination of the hut. In the back corner, partially hidden by fallen debris, was what appeared to be the opening to a tunnel. It was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, but it seemed to extend back into the mountain rather than down toward the valley. Without hesitation, Sarah gathered her gear and squeezed into the tunnel opening. The passage was tight and completely dark, forcing her to feel her way forward by touch. She could hear the voices outside growing closer, and knew that the search team would reach the hut within minutes. The tunnel seemed to extend much farther than she had expected, and Sarah began to worry that she might be crawling into a dead end that would trap her underground. But after several minutes of careful progress, she felt a slight breeze on her face, suggesting that the passage connected to another opening somewhere ahead. Behind her, Sarah heard voices from the hut as the search team arrived. They were speaking in Pashto, but their tone suggested they were conducting a thorough search. She held her breath and remained perfectly still, hoping they wouldn't notice the tunnel entrance hidden in the shadows. The voices grew fainter as the search team apparently concluded that the hut was empty and moved on. Sarah waited several more minutes before continuing her underground journey, wanting to be certain that the immediate threat had passed. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger chamber that appeared to be part of a natural cave system. Sarah's small flashlight revealed ancient rock formations and evidence that the caves had been used by humans in the past. Most importantly, she could feel air circulation that suggested multiple exits to the surface. For the first time in hours, Sarah allowed herself to hope that she might actually escape this mountain alive. The cave system could provide shelter from both the storm and the search teams while she figured out her next move. But she also knew that she couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, she would need to find a way to reach friendly forces or risk dying from exposure and dehydration. Sarah's thoughts turned to the SEAL team she had helped rescue. By now, Rodriguez would be receiving proper medical care, and the entire team would be safe on their base. The knowledge that her sacrifice had saved their lives gave her strength to continue fighting for her own survival. Exploring deeper into the cave system, Sarah discovered what appeared to be an underground stream. The water was cold and clear, providing a much-needed source of hydration. She refilled her water bottles and allowed herself a small drink, savoring the first clean water she had tasted in hours. The caves seemed to extend for considerable distances in multiple directions, creating a natural maze that would be nearly impossible for enemy forces to search effectively. But Sarah also realized that she could easily become lost in the underground labyrinth without proper navigation tools. Using her knife, Sarah began marking her route by scratching arrows into the cave walls. It was a technique she had learned during survival training, designed to prevent getting lost in unfamiliar terrain. The markings would allow her to find her way back to known locations if she needed to retreat. As she explored, Sarah found evidence that these caves had been used as shelter by various groups over the years. Old military equipment, including Soviet-era ammunition boxes, suggested that Mujahideen fighters had used the caves during their war against the Russians. More recent trash indicated that the caves were still occasionally visited by local fighters or smugglers. The discovery of recent use made Sarah more cautious about her movements. If local fighters knew about the caves, they might search them as part of their hunt for her. She needed to find an exit that would allow her to leave the area entirely, rather than simply hiding until the immediate search was called off. Following the underground stream, Sarah hoped it would lead to an exit at a lower elevation. Mountain streams typically flowed toward valleys, and valleys meant roads and potential contact with friendly forces. But the stream seemed to disappear into cracks in the rock that were too small for a person to follow. Her radio remained silent, except for the occasional burst of static. Sarah tried transmitting on various frequencies, hoping to reach any coalition forces in the area, but received no response. The combination of being underground and the continuing storm made communication virtually impossible. Time seemed to move slowly in the dark underground environment. Sarah had no way to tell how long she had been in the caves, and the constant temperature made it difficult to judge whether it was day or night on the surface. Her watch indicated early afternoon, but she wasn't entirely sure it was accurate after the physical stress and temperature changes of the past several hours. As she continued exploring, Sarah began to feel the effects of exhaustion and stress. She had been operating on adrenaline for hours, and her body was beginning to demand rest. But she couldn't afford to sleep while enemy forces were actively searching for her, and the cave system was too large to secure properly. Sarah found a defensible position in a narrow passage where she could rest, while maintaining observation of the approaches. She allowed herself a brief nap, setting her internal clock to wake her after 30 minutes. It was a skill she had developed during her military training, the ability to sleep lightly while remaining alert to danger. She awoke to the sound of voices echoing through the cave system. The enemy search teams had found the cave entrance and were beginning to explore the underground passages. Sarah could hear at least 4 different voices, and they seemed to be splitting up to cover more ground more quickly. Moving deeper into the cave system, Sarah tried to stay ahead of the searchers while looking for an alternate exit. The voices echoed strangely in the underground chambers, making it difficult to judge exactly where the enemy fighters were located. Sometimes they sounded close enough to touch, while other times they seemed impossibly distant. The underground stream she had been following suddenly disappeared into a sinkhole that dropped into darkness. Sarah's flashlight couldn't penetrate the depths, but she could hear water falling far below. It might be possible to rappel down, but without proper equipment it would likely be a one-way trip. Behind her, the voices were getting closer and more organized. The enemy fighters had apparently brought more people into the cave system and were conducting a systematic search. Sarah could hear them calling out to each other as they checked different passages and chambers. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of dogs barking, echoing through the caves. The search teams had brought their tracking animals underground, and the confined space would actually make it easier for the dogs to follow her scent trail. The rain that had been her salvation on the surface meant nothing down here. Sarah moved as quickly as she dared through the narrow passages, but she knew that the dogs would eventually track her down. She needed to find an exit soon, or she would be cornered in the depths of the mountain with no way out. Following a passage that seemed to trend upward, Sarah hoped to find an opening that would take her back to the surface. The airflow was stronger here, suggesting that she was approaching another entrance to the cave system. But as she rounded a corner, her flashlight revealed something that made her heart sink. The passage ended in a solid wall of rock. The barking was getting closer now, and Sarah could hear human voices accompanying the dogs. She was trapped in a dead-end passage with nowhere to run. In desperation, she examined the walls more carefully, looking for any crack or opening that might provide escape. High up on the wall, barely visible in the beam of her flashlight, Sarah spotted what appeared to be a narrow chimney in the rock. It was vertical and looked barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it seemed to extend upward toward what might be the surface. Without hesitation, Sarah began climbing. The rock was rough enough to provide handholds, but the chimney was so narrow that she had to remove her pack and push it ahead of her. Her rifle scraped against the walls as she worked her way upward, the metal-on-rock contact seeming impossibly loud in the confined space. Below her, the dogs had reached the dead-end chamber and were barking frantically. She could hear their handlers examining the walls, probably looking for the same escape route she had found. It would only be a matter of time before they spotted the chimney and followed her up. The vertical passage seemed to go on forever, and Sarah's arms and legs burned with the effort of supporting her weight against the narrow walls. Several times, loose rocks broke away under her hands, clattering down the chimney toward the searchers below. Each sound drew excited barking from the dogs and shouts from their handlers. Just when Sarah thought she couldn't climb any higher, her hand broke through into open air. She had reached the top of the chimney and was emerging onto the surface somewhere on the mountainside. But as she pulled herself out of the opening, she realized that her problems were far from over. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystal-clear afternoon that offered unlimited visibility across the mountain valley. From her position, Sarah could see enemy fighters positioned on multiple ridges and several vehicles moving along the mountain roads. The clear weather that allowed her to see them also meant that they could easily spot her if she moved carelessly. Worse, she could hear sounds of pursuit from the chimney below. The enemy fighters had found her route and were attempting to follow her to the surface. The narrow passage would slow them down, but they would eventually emerge from the same opening she had used. Sarah's radio suddenly crackled to life as she emerged from the underground interference. Any station, this is Overwatch. Request immediate extraction support. Grid reference follows. The response came immediately from a familiar voice. Overwatch, this is Guardian Angel. We have been searching for you for 6 hours. What is your current status? Guardian Angel. I am on foot, surrounded by hostiles, and about to have company coming up through a cave opening. I need immediate close air support and extraction. Copy that. We have your position marked and are inbound with a full hunter-killer team. ETA 8 minutes. Can you hold out that long? Sarah looked around at her exposed position and listened to the sounds of pursuit getting closer from below. I'll have to. Marking position with infrared strobe now. She activated her emergency beacon and found what cover she could among the rocks near the cave opening. When the enemy fighters emerged from the chimney, they would be completely exposed and vulnerable. But if more than one or two came up at once, she would be outnumbered and outgunned. The first fighter to emerge from the cave was the handler for one of the tracking dogs. Sarah's shot dropped him instantly, but his fall alerted the others below to the danger waiting above. The dog, confused by the sudden violence, began barking frantically and running in circles. More voices echoed from the chimney as the remaining fighters tried to figure out how to deal with the sniper waiting above their only exit. Sarah knew that they would eventually coordinate an assault, probably sending multiple fighters up simultaneously to overwhelm her position. Her radio crackled again with updates from Guardian Angel. Overwatch, we have visual on your position and multiple hostiles converging from different directions. Stand by for danger close fire support. Sarah pressed herself against the rocks as the distinctive sound of the AC-130's weapon systems filled the air. The 25mm cannon spoke first, sending precision rounds into enemy positions on the surrounding ridges. Each burst was followed by explosions and the screams of wounded fighters. The psychological effect of the gunship's arrival was immediate and dramatic. Enemy fighters who had been advancing confidently toward Sarah's position suddenly found themselves under attack from an invisible enemy in the sky. Many of them abandoned their assault and sought cover, while others attempted to flee the area entirely. But Sarah's immediate problem remained unsolved. The fighters in the cave system below were still trying to reach the surface, and she could hear them arguing about the best way to deal with the sniper above. Eventually, desperation would drive them to attempt a coordinated assault, and Sarah wasn't sure she had enough ammunition to stop them all. Then Guardian Angel made an announcement that changed everything. Overwatch, we have fast movers inbound with close air support. Recommend you take cover immediately. Sarah understood that fast movers meant jet aircraft with bombs or missiles. She pressed herself as deeply as possible into the rocks around the cave opening and covered her ears. When the bombs hit, the entire mountainside shook with the force of the explosions, and rocks rained down from above. The cave system behind her collapsed completely, sealing off the enemy fighters who had been pursuing her underground. The entrance she had used to escape was now buried under tons of rock and debris. Anyone still in the caves was trapped permanently. Overwatch, this is Guardian Angel. LZ is secure for extraction. Pop smoke and prepare for immediate pickup. Sarah activated her smoke grenade and watched the orange marker drift across the mountainside. Within minutes, she could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching through the mountain air. After 18 hours of fighting for her life, Sarah Martinez was finally going home. The rescue helicopter touched down in a swirl of dust and debris, its rotors creating a miniature sandstorm on the rocky mountainside. Sarah ran toward the aircraft in a crouch, her legs shaking with exhaustion after 18 hours of constant stress and movement. Strong hands reached out to pull her aboard as the helicopter lifted off immediately, not wanting to remain stationary any longer than necessary in hostile territory. "Welcome aboard, Sergeant Martinez," shouted the crew chief over the noise of the rotors. "You gave us quite a scare. Command thought you were KIA when we lost contact." Sarah collapsed into a seat and accepted a bottle of water from one of the crewmen. Her hands trembled as she drank, the adrenaline that had kept her alive finally beginning to fade. For the first time since the mission began, she allowed herself to truly relax, knowing that she was finally safe. The helicopter banked sharply as it departed the area, and Sarah could see the smoke still rising from where Guardian Angel's bombs had collapsed the cave system. Somewhere under all that rock and debris were the enemy fighters who had pursued her underground. It was a sobering reminder of how close she had come to joining them in a permanent grave. "How's Rodriguez?" Sarah asked, thinking of the wounded SEAL who had been evacuated hours earlier. "He's stable and already back at the field hospital," the crew chief replied. "Doctors say he'll make a full recovery. The whole team has been asking about you since they got back." As the helicopter flew toward the base, Sarah reflected on the mission that had almost cost her life. What was supposed to be a routine Overwatch assignment had turned into an 18-hour survival ordeal that tested every skill she had learned in her military career. But the important thing was that everyone had made it home alive. The base came into view as they crested a ridge, its collection of temporary buildings and defensive positions, a welcome sight after the hostile mountains. Sarah could see people gathering on the landing pad, probably drawn by word that the missing sniper had been found. As the helicopter touched down, Sarah was surprised to see Lieutenant Commander Torres waiting on the tarmac with his entire SEAL team. They had obviously delayed their own departure to wait for news of her rescue. Rodriguez was there too, supported by crutches but determined to be present when his rescuer returned. "Outstanding work out there, Sergeant," Torres said as Sarah stepped off the helicopter. "Your actions saved all our lives. We owe you a debt we can never repay." Sarah felt embarrassed by the attention and praise. In her mind, she had simply done her job, providing overwatch and support for the ground team. The fact that it had turned into a desperate fight for survival was just an unfortunate consequence of operating in hostile territory. "Just glad everyone made it home, sir," she replied. "That's what we're here for." But Torres wasn't finished. "What you did out there went far beyond the call of duty. You sacrificed your own safety to ensure our escape, then fought against impossible odds for 18 hours to make it back alive. That's the kind of courage and dedication that defines the best of our military." The base commander approached the group, having been alerted to Sarah's return. Colonel Williams was a career officer who had served multiple combat deployments and knew heroism when he saw it. He looked Sarah over, taking in her exhausted appearance and battle-worn equipment. "Sergeant Martinez, I'm recommending you for the Silver Star for your actions during this mission," he announced. "Your courage under fire and dedication to saving fellow service members exemplifies the finest traditions of the United States military." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the recognition. The Silver Star was one of the military's highest decorations for valor, typically reserved for acts of extraordinary heroism in combat. She had never imagined that doing her job, even under extreme circumstances, would warrant such recognition. Over the following days, as reports were written and statements were taken, the full scope of Sarah's actions became clear to the command structure. She had single-handedly held off a company-sized enemy force, rescued a trapped SEAL team, and survived 18 hours behind enemy lines with minimal resources. Military analysts estimated that she had killed or wounded at least 20 enemy fighters during her escape and evasion. The story of the mission spread throughout the special operations community, earning Sarah a reputation as one of the most skilled and courageous snipers in the military. Requests began coming in from various units asking for her assignment to their teams, recognizing the value of having such a capable operator providing overwatch support. But for Sarah, the most meaningful recognition came from the SEAL team she had saved. They presented her with a plaque bearing their team motto and the inscription, "To Guardian Angel, you brought us home." It was a simple gesture, but it meant more to her than any medal or official commendation. Months later, after returning to the United States, Sarah was invited to speak at various military schools and training facilities about her experiences. She used these opportunities to emphasize the importance of training, preparation, and mental toughness in overcoming impossible situations. The mountains of Afghanistan taught me that survival isn't just about having the right equipment or knowing the right techniques, she would tell her audiences. It's about having the mental strength to keep fighting when everything seems hopeless, and the commitment to never give up on your fellow warriors. Sarah's actions that day had a lasting impact on military doctrine as well. Her successful use of caves and underground terrain for escape and evasion led to changes in training programs, with more emphasis placed on unconventional escape routes and survival techniques in complex terrain. The SEAL team that Sarah saved continued to serve with distinction, but they never forgot the debt they owed to the Riflewoman who heard their cry for help. Rodriguez made a full recovery and was eventually promoted to Senior Chief Petty Officer. Torres continued to lead special operations missions until his retirement, always crediting Sarah's example with teaching him the true meaning of sacrifice for fellow service members. Years later, when Sarah finally retired from the military, she chose to return to her family's ranch in Texas. But she remained in contact with the SEALs she had saved, forming bonds that transcended rank and service branch. They had shared something that only combat veterans could truly understand: the knowledge that someone had been willing to risk everything to bring them home. The mountain cave where Sarah had made her desperate escape was eventually sealed permanently by coalition forces, becoming an unmarked grave for the enemy fighters trapped inside. But for those who knew the story, it remained a monument to the courage and sacrifice of American service members who answered the call when their brothers and sisters were in danger. Sarah's legacy lived on in the countless soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who heard her story and were inspired to serve with the same level of dedication and courage. She had proven that heroism wasn't about size or gender or background. It was about having the heart of a warrior and the commitment to never leave a fallen comrade behind. The mountains of Afghanistan had tested Sarah Martinez in ways she never could have imagined, but they had also revealed the true depth of her character. When the SEALs cried out for rescue, a shadowed riflewoman had heard their plea and answered with everything she had. In the end, that was enough to bring everyone home.